The galaxy knew humans as healers. For 142 years, since the day they first made contact with the stars, humanity had chosen peace. They had joined the Galactic Concord, a coalition of 412 spacefaring species, and they had done something no predator species had ever done before. They gave up their weapons. Not because they were forced to, not because they lost a war. They simply looked at the galaxy and decided they wanted to be better. And they were. Human doctors traveled to plague worlds where no other species dared to go. Human engineers built bridges between civilizations that had hated each other for thousands of years. Human diplomats sat in rooms full of screaming aliens, and somehow, with patience and coffee and a strange talent for finding common ground, made peace happen. The galaxy had a saying that everyone knew. If you wanted something destroyed, you called the Krail. If you wanted something built, you called the humans. Ambassador Lena Vasquez had spent 20 years proving that saying true. She sat now in the Great Hall of the Concord Council, on the station world of Thessera Prime. The hall was enormous, built to hold representatives of hundreds of species. Light from a dying star poured through crystal walls, painting everything in shades of amber and gold. Around her, aliens of every shape argued about trade routes and border disputes and mining rights, the usual business of a galaxy that couldn't agree on anything. Vasquez was 63 years old. Her dark hair had gone silver at the temples. Her face carried the lines of someone who had smiled often and slept little. She wore a simple gray suit with a small blue pin on her collar, the emblem of Earth's diplomatic corps. No weapons, no armor, just words and patience. She had brokered the Treaty of Voss, ending a war between the Ilari and the Chelun that had burned for 800 years. She had negotiated the famine accords that saved 3 billion Torani from starvation. She had talked a Krail Warfleet commander out of bombing a civilian station by sitting with him for 9 hours and simply listening to his grief about his dead son. That was what humans did. They listened, they helped, they built. And the galaxy, for the most part, loved them for it. But love and respect are not always the same thing. Vasquez noticed it in the small things. The way certain council members smiled at human delegates, the way adults smile at children who say something cute. The way military species like the Krail and the Torvans talked about human softness in corridors when they thought no one was listening. The way some species treated humanity's choice to disarm, not as strength, but as proof that humans were simply not dangerous enough to matter. It bothered her, but she never let it show, because proving them wrong would mean proving them right about something else entirely. On this particular day, Vasquez had a concern that would not leave her mind. She had received a report 3 days ago from a Concord intelligence officer named Rethis, a tall, thin insectoid from the Thylan species. The Thylans were the galaxy's information gatherers. They watched everything and said little. When a Thylan spoke, wise people listened. Rethis had told her that the Vraxith Dominion was moving ships near the border, not just patrol ships, heavy warships, troop carriers, the kind of fleet you build when you plan to take something. The Vraxith were not members of the Concord. They were a reptilian empire that ruled through fear and force. For decades, they had raided fringe colonies, tested borders, and pushed outward. The Concord's response had always been the same. Trade deals, concessions, polite warnings. The Concord believed in diplomacy above all else, which was part of why humanity had joined in the first place. But there was a difference between diplomacy and cowardice, and Vasquez was starting to wonder which one the Concord practiced. Her concern was specific. It had a name. Elysium 4. It was a human colony world settled 80 years ago. A green and gentle planet of rolling hills and warm oceans. 2.3 million people lived there. Farmers, teachers, artists, families with children who had never seen Earth, but called themselves human with pride. It was the kind of place people dreamed about when they thought of what humanity could be at its best. It was also dangerously close to the Vraxith border, and it was completely undefended. No shield generators, no warships in orbit, nothing, because the Concord Demilitarization Treaty said human worlds did not need weapons, because the Concord would protect them, because that was the deal. Vasquez stood before the council that afternoon and raised her concern. She spoke clearly and calmly, as she always did. She presented the intelligence about Vraxith fleet movements. She showed the projected paths. She requested that the Concord send a defensive patrol to the Elysium sector, just as a precaution. The council listened politely. The Vraxith representative, because the Vraxith did send observers, even if they were not members, stood and called the concern human paranoia. The Torvan military delegate said his analysts saw no threat. The Ilari finance minister worried that sending ships would provoke the Vraxith and damage trade relations. The motion failed. Vasquez stood in the chamber as species filed out around her. Rethus, the Thylan intelligence officer, paused beside her. His compound eyes reflected the amber light. "I am sorry, Ambassador," he said quietly. "I believe your concern is valid." "Then why didn't your delegation vote with us?" she asked. Rethus was silent for a moment, because the Concord has survived for 6,000 years by avoiding conflict. It does not know how to prepare for one. He left. Vasquez stood alone in the great hall. She thought about Elysium 4. She thought about the children there, playing in fields under an alien sun, not knowing that somewhere in the dark between stars, ships with guns were moving closer. She thought about the promise the Concord had made, that if humanity put down its weapons, the galaxy would keep them safe. She wanted to believe it. She had built her entire life on believing it. That night, she sent a personal message to the governor of Elysium 4, an old friend named Thomas Achebe. She told him to quietly review evacuation procedures, just in case. He wrote back with a laughing emoji and said she worried too much. 3 weeks later, 200 Vraxith warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel above Elysium 4. Their weapons were already armed, their targeting systems were already locked, and there was nothing in orbit to stop them. Not a single ship, not a single gun. Just 2.3 million people looking up at the sky, wondering why the stars were falling. Dr. Emil Achebe was eating breakfast when the sky split open. He was sitting in the small kitchen of the medical center in New Accra, the largest city on Elysium 4. He had a cup of tea in one hand and a piece of toast in the other, and he was reading a message from his father, Governor Thomas Achebe, about a fishing trip they had planned for the weekend. Emil was 34 years old. He had his mother's kind eyes and his father's stubborn jaw. He had come to Elysium 4 5 years ago to run the colony's largest children's hospital. He loved his work. He loved this world. Then the first explosion hit, and the window behind him turned white. The sound came a second later, a deep rolling thunder that shook the walls and knocked him from his chair. He hit the floor, and the tea shattered beside him, and before he could even understand what was happening, the emergency sirens began to scream. He ran outside. The sky above New Accra was full of ships. Not Concord ships. Not human ships. Dark, angular vessels with red markings that he recognized from news reports he had never paid enough attention to. Vraxith warships. Hundreds of them. They hung in the atmosphere like a ceiling of iron, and from their bellies fire was falling. Not bombs in the traditional sense. Something worse. Atmospheric incendiary weapons that turned the air itself into flame. Entire districts of the city were already burning. He could see the residential towers to the east collapsing inward, folding like paper in the heat. The sound of it was like nothing he had ever heard. A roaring, living sound, as if the planet itself was screaming. Emil ran back inside. The hospital was chaos. Nurses were pulling children from beds. Doctors were shouting. The power flickered, died, came back on emergency generators. His hands were shaking, but he forced them steady. He was a doctor. This was what he trained for. Not this exactly, but the principle was the same. People were hurt, he could help. He activated his neural implant and set it to record. He did not think about why. Some instinct told him that what was happening needed to be seen. Over the next 3 hours, Emil HFY lived through something that no human should ever have to witness. He carried children from a burning school, 17 of them, small bodies, some no older than 5, covered in ash, and crying for parents they would never see again. He set broken bones with strips of curtain. He performed surgery on a kitchen table with a flashlight held between his teeth. He held a woman's hand as she died, and told her that her son was safe, even though he did not know if it was true. The Vraxith ground troops arrived in the 4th hour. They came in heavy transports that crushed the streets beneath them. The soldiers were tall, scaled, armored in black and red, and they did not behave like an invading army. They behaved like hunters. Emil watched from a broken window as Vraxith soldiers walked through the streets of New Accra and shot everyone they found. Not combatants. There were no combatants. Elysium 4 had no army, no police force with weapons, nothing. The Vraxith were shooting farmers, shopkeepers, a woman pushing a stroller, an old man sitting in the ruins of his house, too shocked to move. Some of the soldiers were laughing. The Vraxith commander, a massive figure in gold-trimmed armor, broadcast a message across all channels. Emil heard it through every speaker, every device, every screen that still functioned. The commander's voice was deep and cold and full of satisfaction. Let this be the lesson the soft ones teach the galaxy. Mercy is weakness. Emil kept recording. He kept working. He pulled survivors into the basement of the hospital and barricaded the doors. He had 41 people with him, 26 of them children. He rationed water. He treated burns with wet cloth. He told the children stories to keep them from screaming when explosions shook dust from the ceiling. By the 8th hour, evacuation shuttles tried to launch from the spaceport on the edge of the city. Emil watched the feeds on his implant. The shuttles rose into the sky, packed with civilians. The Vraxith ships shot them down one by one. Bright flashes against the dark smoke. Each flash was a shuttle. Each shuttle held hundreds of people, families who thought they had escaped. They fell from the sky like burning leaves. By the 11th hour, Emil knew he was going to die. The Vraxith troops had found the hospital. He could hear them breaking through the upper floors. He could hear the screams of the people he had not been able to reach in time. He gathered the children behind him and stood in the doorway of the basement. He had no weapon. He had a scalpel in his pocket. He did not take it out. It would have been pointless. He looked at his neural implants recording. 11 hours of footage, everything. The fire, the children, the laughter of the soldiers, the shuttles falling, the old man who would not move, all of it. He opened a broadcast channel, not a private one. He connected to the Concorde's open emergency frequency, the one that every species monitored, the one that reached every station and ship and planet in known space. He transmitted everything. Then he looked into the recording and spoke his last words. His voice was steady. His eyes were dry. He was very tired and very sad and very human. My name is Dr. Emil HFY. I am a pediatrician on Elysium 4. In the last 11 hours, the Vraxith Dominion has killed everyone I know. I am sending this so the galaxy can see what was done to us. Please, do not look away. We did not have that choice. The door behind him broke open. The recording ended. Across the galaxy, 14 billion humans watched it. They watched it on Earth, on Mars, on Luna, on stations and ships and colonies scattered across 1,000 light-years. They watched a doctor hold children in a burning basement and ask the galaxy not to look away. The galaxy watched too. The Concord Council convened an emergency session within hours. The Great Hall on Thesara Prime was full. Every species was represented. The air was thick with voices and arguments, and the particular kind of urgency that powerful beings feel when something terrible has happened, and they need to appear as if they care. A resolution was proposed. A diplomatic censure, strong language, deep concern, a formal request that the Vraxith explain their actions. Some delegates argued in whispers that perhaps the humans should not have settled so close to the border, that the colony's placement was provocative, that this was tragic, yes, but also perhaps avoidable. No one proposed military action. No one proposed sanctions. No one proposed anything that might actually cost them something. Ambassador Lena Vasquez sat through the entire session. She did not speak. She did not weep. She did not argue. She sat in her chair with her hands folded in her lap. And she listened to 411 species discuss the murder of 2.3 million of her people as though it were a scheduling problem. When the session ended, Vasquez stood. The hall grew quiet. Every eye and sensor and optical cluster turned to her, waiting for the speech, the plea, the emotional appeal. That was what humans did, after all. They talked, they begged, they believed in words. Vasquez reached up and removed the small blue pin from her collar, the emblem of Earth's diplomatic corps. She had worn it for 20 years. She placed it on the table in front of her. The tiny sound of metal on wood was the loudest thing in the hall. Then she turned and walked out. She did not look back. Across the galaxy, on a world still burning, the ashes of 2.3 million people drifted in a wind that no one was left to feel. And in a basement beneath a ruined hospital, a scalpel lay on the floor next to a broken chair. And the neural implant of a dead doctor blinked its last light and went dark. For 72 hours after the massacre, Earth went silent. No diplomatic messages, no trade communications, no human ships launched from any port. Human embassies on 100 worlds closed their doors, pulled their staff inside, and stopped answering calls. The Concord's Human Liaison Office on Thesara Prime put up a single message on its door. Closed until further notice. The galaxy noticed, of course, but most species assumed it was grief. Humans were emotional creatures. They needed time. They would cry, they would mourn, and then they would come back to the negotiating table, because that was what humans always did. They talked, they forgave, they moved on. On the Concord Council floor, business continued. New trade agreements were discussed. A border dispute between two minor species was mediated. The massacre of Elysium 4 was referenced once, briefly, as the recent incident in the human sector. A moment of silence was observed. It lasted 12 seconds. The Vraxith Dominion sent no apology. Their supreme commander, a scarred veteran named Torvok, gave a public interview in which he called the attack a necessary correction, and said that weak species invited destruction. He laughed when asked if he feared human retaliation. "What will they do?" he said. "Write us a letter?" On Earth, behind closed doors, something very different was happening. The United Earth Parliament met in emergency session. Every representative from every nation, territory, colony, and orbital station was present, either in person or by quantum link. There were no empty seats. There were no absent votes. For the first time in the Parliament's history, the session was closed to all outside observers. No aliens, no Concord representatives, no press. The session lasted 9 hours. The vote was unanimous. Not a single dissenting voice. Every human representative, from every culture, every continent, every political party, every colony world, voted the same way. Later, historians would call it the most unified moment in human history. The species that could never agree on anything agreed on this. When the session ended, a single transmission was prepared. It was loaded onto every communications array humanity possessed. Every satellite, every deep space beacon, every relay station. It was set to broadcast on every frequency the galaxy used. Diplomatic, military, commercial, emergency, and several frequencies that no one knew humans had access to. The woman who read it was Speaker Yuki Tanaka. She was 57 years old, small in stature, with short gray hair and eyes that could freeze water. She had been a constitutional law professor before entering politics. She had never raised her voice in 20 years of public life. She did not raise it now. She stood in front of a single camera in a plain room with no decorations. She wore black. She held no notes. She looked directly into the lens, and when she spoke, her voice reached every corner of the known galaxy. To the species of the Galactic Concord, to the Vraxith Dominion, to all who are listening, she paused, just long enough. 142 years, humanity chose to be civilized. We put away our weapons. We healed your sick. We built your bridges. We brokered your peace. We buried our nature, our true nature, because we believed the galaxy deserved better than what we were. You repaid us with silence while our children burned. We came to you with evidence of the threat. We begged for protection. You voted against us. And when 2.3 million of our people were slaughtered on a world we were promised would be safe, you offered words, deep concern, diplomatic censure. You debated whether it was our fault for living too close to the monsters. We heard you. We understood. Effective immediately, the Human Civilized Conduct Accord is dissolved. All demilitarization treaties are rescinded. All diplomatic conventions with the Galactic Concord are suspended. All human military assets are reactivated. We are reopening the vaults. To the Vraxith Dominion specifically, you wanted to teach the galaxy a lesson about humanity. Congratulations. You will. We are no longer civilized. Run. The transmission ended. The screen went black. And across the galaxy, 411 species began to learn what the vaults meant. The vaults were not a secret. Not exactly. They were part of the original agreement when humanity joined the Concord. Humans had agreed to disarm, but they had insisted on one condition. They would store their weapons rather than destroy them. The Concord had agreed, because at the time it seemed like a small thing. What did it matter if the humans kept old guns in a basement? They would never use them. The vaults were deep bunkers beneath Earth, Luna, and Mars. They held the weapons humanity had built during its long and bloody history before the stars. Nuclear warheads, kinetic bombardment platforms, biological research, artificial intelligence combat systems, warship designs, and something called the Prometheus Doctrine, a complete theoretical framework for total war that human military scientists had spent decades creating, a plan so thorough and so terrifying that the generation who wrote it had locked it away and sworn it would never be opened. But the Concord's intelligence agencies had never looked too closely at the vaults. Why would they? The humans were harmless. Now, every intelligence service in the galaxy pulled their old files on humanity and read them with new eyes. Rethus, the Thylan intelligence officer, was asked to deliver a briefing to the Concord Council. He stood in the great hall where Vasquez had once stood, and his compound eyes swept across the assembled species. We made a critical error, he said. We assumed that humans were peaceful because they were incapable of violence. This is wrong. Humans are peaceful because they are the most violent species in the known galaxy, and they were trying very hard not to be. He presented the data, human history, the parts that humanity had politely not talked about for a century and a half. The world wars that killed hundreds of millions, the nuclear weapons they had built, enough to destroy their own planet several times over, and then pointed at each other for decades. The genocides, the conquests, the empires built on blood. A species that had invented a word for the deliberate extinction of an entire people because they needed a word for something they kept doing. He showed them the military analysis. Human reflexes were faster than 90% of known species. Their endurance was unmatched. They could function without sleep for days. They healed from injuries that would kill most aliens. They could adapt to almost any environment. They were pursuit predators, evolved to chase prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. And their creativity and violence was by any objective measure extraordinary. The humans did not disarm because they were weak, Rethus said. They disarmed because they knew exactly what they were capable of, and it frightened them. We should have been frightened too. The council chamber was very quiet. On the Vraxith homeworld, Supreme Commander Torvak watched the human broadcast with his officers. A real deep laugh that echoed through his war room. His officers laughed with him. The farmers want to fight, he said. They have been peaceful for 150 years. Their oldest soldiers have never seen combat. They will come with their old weapons and their old ships, and we will break them like we broke their colony. He poured a drink and raised it. To easy victories. His officers cheered. None of them noticed that their youngest intelligence analyst, a small Vraxith female sitting in the corner, was not cheering. She had spent the last hour reading human history files. Her hands were shaking. She had gotten to the section about nuclear weapons, and she had not been able to continue. She wanted to tell the Supreme Commander that he was wrong, that he was making the worst mistake any Vraxith had ever made, that the humans had not been peaceful because they were weak. They had been peaceful because they were terrified of themselves. She said nothing. In the Vraxith Dominion, junior officers did not contradict their superiors. She would be dead in 97 days, along with every officer in that room. Back on Earth, in a vast, underground facility beneath the mountains of what was once called Switzerland. Enormous doors that had not opened in 142 years began to move. Dust fell from hinges the size of buildings. Lights flickered on in tunnels that stretched for miles. Machines that had been maintained in perfect condition by automated systems hummed to life. The vaults were open, and deep inside, behind a final sealed door marked with a single word, Prometheus, a file began to upload to every human military network in existence. Humanity had spent 142 years learning how to be kind. It took them 72 hours to remember how to be something else. The galaxy expected months, maybe years. That was how long it took a civilization to build a war fleet. You needed shipyards. You needed materials. You needed trained crews and supply chains, and the thousand small things that turned metal into a weapon. The Krail, the galaxy's most feared military species, had once taken 6 years to build a strike fleet for a border war. Humanity did it in 3 weeks. The first sign came from the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. Deep space sensors operated by a Torvan trade company detected massive energy signatures where there should have been nothing but rock and silence. When they pointed their telescopes at the source, they found shipyards, enormous ones, automated construction platforms that stretched across kilometers of space, building warships from blueprints that were being fed to them in real time. The platforms were not new. They had been there for decades, hidden inside hollowed-out asteroids, maintained by machines, waiting. The Concord's intelligence community had a collective moment of terrible understanding. The humans had not just stored their old weapons, they had continued to design new ones. Every year, every single year of the peace. Quietly, secretly, in research facilities that no one had ever thought to look for, human scientists and engineers had kept working, improving, preparing. Not because they wanted war, but because some part of them, some ancient and honest part, had always known that the peace might not last. They had hoped they were wrong. They had prayed they were wrong. They were not wrong. Admiral Cale Morrow stood on the bridge of the HSS Retribution, the flagship of the newly formed 1st Retribution Fleet. He was 51 years old, tall, lean, with close-cropped gray hair, and eyes that looked like they had been emptied of everything warm. He had been a logistics officer for most of his career, managing supply routes between human colonies. He had never commanded a warship. 6 months ago, he had never stood on one. But he had a daughter named Suki, who was 9 years old and who had lived on Elysium 4 with her mother. He had a recording on his personal device of Suki laughing at her birthday party 3 months before the massacre. He had watched it once. He would not watch it again until this was over. He did not give speeches. He did not talk about honor or revenge or justice. When his officers gathered for their first briefing, he simply projected a map of Vraxith space onto the tactical display, marked the positions of their border fleet, and said, "We begin here. Questions?" There were no questions. The Concord sent messages demanding that humanity stand down. They invoked treaties. They cited regulations. They warned of consequences. Speaker Tanaka's response was 4 sentences long. "You had your chance to act. You chose a resolution. We choose differently. Do not contact us again on this matter." 3 Concord species offered to mediate between humanity and the Vraxith. Tanaka declined. 2 species threatened to impose sanctions on human trade. Tanaka told them they were welcome to try, but they should check how many of their medical systems, communication networks, and food distribution programs were built and maintained by human engineers first. The sanctions were quietly dropped. The 1st Retribution Fleet jumped to the Vraxith border on a Tuesday. It was not a large fleet by galactic standards, 47 warships. The Vraxith had 300 ships guarding their border, commanded by a veteran officer named Kreth, who had won a dozen campaigns against smaller species. Kreth looked at the human fleet on his sensors and felt nothing but amusement. This would be simple. The battle lasted 6 hours. When it ended, every Vraxith border ship was either destroyed or disabled. The human fleet lost 4 ships. The galaxy could not understand what had happened. Military analysts from a dozen species reviewed the battle data and came away shaken. The humans had not fought the way other species fought. There was no line formation, no predictable patterns, no standard tactics that could be studied and countered. Every human ship seemed to operate independently and yet in perfect coordination, like fingers on a hand. They changed strategies mid-battle, sometimes mid-minute. They exploited weaknesses that should have been invisible. They hacked Vraxith communication systems and fed false orders to their own ships, turning the enemy fleet against itself. They used weapons that the Concord's databases had no record of. A Krail military commander, watching the analysis with professional interest, said something that became famous across the galaxy. Other species study war. Humans are war. It lives in them like a second heartbeat. They simply learned to keep it quiet. The Vraxith Supreme Commander Torvok was no longer laughing. For the first time in his long career, he sent a communication requesting negotiation. He used diplomatic language. He suggested a ceasefire. He implied that terms could be discussed. Admiral Morrow received the message. He read it once. Then he transmitted a single file in response. The unedited recording from Dr. Emma Lachaby's neural implant. 11 hours of footage. The burning, the children, the laughter of Vraxith soldiers, the shuttles falling from the sky. Nothing else. No words. No terms. The first Retribution fleet crossed into Vraxic space the next day. What followed was not a war in any traditional sense. It was a dismantling. Humanity did not carpet bomb Vraxic worlds. They did not use weapons of mass destruction. They did not target civilian populations. What they did was worse in a way, because it showed a level of control that made pure rage look simple by comparison. They destroyed every military installation, every shipyard, every weapons factory, every orbital defense platform, every military communications relay. They moved through Vraxic space like surgeons cutting out a disease, leaving the healthy tissue untouched. Cities were left standing, farms were left growing, water systems and power grids were left intact. But everything with a gun was turned to dust. The precision was what terrified the galaxy most. A vengeful species would have made the Vraxic suffer the way Elysium 4 had suffered. But humanity was not angry. Not anymore. They had passed through anger in those 72 hours of silence, and come out the other side into something colder and more focused. They were not burning with rage. They were operating with the mechanical efficiency of a species that had spent a century and a half pretending it did not know how to do this. The Concord watched with growing fear. Not fear of the Vraxic, fear of what came next. Every species with a military began quiet calculations. If the humans could do this to the Vraxic in weeks, what could they do to us? Old alliances shifted overnight. Some species sent quiet messages to Earth, offering resources, ships, and support. Others reinforced their borders. The Alari, who had once called humans charmingly harmless, quietly doubled their defense budget. Rethus, the Thylan analyst, prepared a second briefing for the council. He stood in the same spot as before, but this time his voice was different. There was something in it that the council had never heard from a Thylan before. Something that sounded very much like fear. The Vraxic dominion will fall, he said. This is now certain. The question the council must consider is not whether the humans will win. It is what the humans will want when they are finished winning. No one had an answer. On Earth, in a small apartment, in a city called Lisbon, Lena Vasquez sat by a window and watched the sunset over the Atlantic Ocean. She was no longer an ambassador. She had resigned formally the day after she walked out of the council chamber. She held no title now. She was just a woman in a quiet room, watching the news on a screen that showed human warships burning through Vraxic space like a blade through cloth. She had spent her life proving that humanity could be more than its history, that the violence was behind them, that they had evolved past the thing that made other species afraid of them. She had been right. They could be more. They had been more for 142 years. But being more was a choice, and the galaxy had taught them that choices have consequences on both sides. You could choose to be gentle, and the galaxy could choose to let your children burn. Vasquez watched the fleet advance on her screen. She watched the precise, clinical destruction of a civilization that had laughed while killing 2 million people. She put her face in her hands. She did not cry for the Vraxic. She cried for the humans who would have to live with what they were becoming. She cried because she knew that the gentle hand humanity had offered the galaxy was not gone. It was just holding a sword now, and she did not know if it would ever be able to let go. The Vraxic dominion fell in 97 days. Not conquered, not destroyed, dismantled. There is a difference, and the difference mattered more than anything else humanity did during those 3 months of war. On the 97th day, the first Retribution fleet entered orbit above the Vraxic homeworld. Admiral Morrow stood on the bridge of the Retribution and looked down at the planet through the viewport. It was a dry, rust-colored world with vast deserts and deep canyons. Cities spread across its surface like gray stains. 8 billion Vraxic lived below, civilians, families. Children who had never held a weapon and had no part in the decision to burn Elysium-4. His weapons officer reported that all orbital defenses had been neutralized. The planet was defenseless. Every military installation on the surface had been identified and targeted. They could end it in hours. A single order. Morrow stared at the planet for a long time. Then he gave his order. Ground forces only. Precision strikes on military targets. Arrest the leadership. Protect civilian infrastructure. Any soldier who harmed a non-combatant would face court-martial. His officers obeyed without hesitation. They had expected nothing else. Human soldiers landed on the Vraxith homeworld in armored transports. They moved through the streets of the capital city, with weapons ready but not firing. The Vraxith military had collapsed. Most units had surrendered after their fleets were destroyed. The few that resisted were dealt with quickly and precisely. The soldiers cleared government buildings and military headquarters. They arrested Supreme Commander Torvak in his war room. He was sitting at his desk, alone, staring at nothing. The drink he had raised in celebration weeks ago was still on the table, half finished. He looked at the human soldiers and said nothing. Within hours, human medical teams were on the ground. They set up field hospitals. They distributed food and clean water to Vraxith civilians who had been cut off from supplies during the conflict. Human engineers restored power to districts that had lost it. They treated wounded Vraxith soldiers alongside their own injured. A Vraxith mother, clutching her child, watched a human medic bandage a wound on a Vraxith elder's arm. She did not understand. These were the people who had just destroyed her civilization's entire military in 3 months, and now they were feeding her child. Why? She asked the medic. The medic, a young woman from a colony world called New Helsinki, looked up. She was tired. She had not slept in 2 days. "Because you're hurt," she said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. Across the galaxy, the Concord Council watched and waited. 411 species held their breath. Humanity now possessed the most powerful military force in known space. The Vraxith were broken. Every other major military power was weaker than what humans had just demonstrated. If humanity wanted to, they could reshape the galaxy. They could demand territory, tribute, submission. They could become the very thing the Vraxith had been, but on a scale no species had ever achieved. Speaker Yuki Tanaka addressed the galaxy for the second time. She stood in the same plain room. She wore the same black clothing. Her face showed the weight of what the past months had cost her. She had authorized a war. She had sent young people to kill and die. She would carry that for the rest of her life. But her voice was steady and her eyes were clear. The Vraxith Dominion has been disarmed. Their military leadership has been arrested and will face trial by an independent tribunal composed of species that were not involved in this conflict. Their civilians have received aid and will continue to receive it. We did not come to exterminate. We came to make sure that what was done to Elysium-4 can never be done again. She paused. To the Galactic Concord, we will not rejoin your institution. We trusted it with the lives of our people, and it failed them. 2.3 million humans died because the Concord believed that a strongly worded letter was an adequate response to mass murder. We will not place our survival in your hands again. But we will not become what we destroyed. Humanity will maintain its fleet. This is not negotiable. But our ships will not be used for conquest or expansion. We will defend any species that cannot defend itself. We will answer any distress call from any world, without condition. If a defenseless people are threatened, we will come, because it is right. But understand this clearly. The gentle hand we once offered the galaxy was a choice. We made that choice freely, and we were proud of it. We are still proud of it. But choices can be unmade. The galaxy showed us what happens when gentleness is mistaken for weakness. We will not make that mistake again, and neither should you. Treat the vulnerable with care. Protect those who cannot protect themselves, because we will be watching, and we are no longer patient. The transmission ended. The galaxy did not cheer. It did not celebrate. It sat in a very deep and very uncomfortable silence and thought about what it had just heard. Humanity had not threatened anyone, but the message was clear. There was a new rule in the galaxy, and it was simple. You do not harm the defenseless, not because of treaties or trade deals or diplomatic consequences, because the humans were out there, and they remembered what happened when the galaxy looked away. 10 years passed. The galaxy changed. Not overnight, and not completely, but in ways that were impossible to ignore. No species committed an atrocity against a defenseless world. Border raids dropped to nearly zero. 3 separate conflicts that were building toward war were quietly resolved when one side or the other received a polite message from a human diplomatic vessel suggesting that perhaps negotiation would be a better path. The messages were always polite. The diplomatic vessels were always escorted by dreadnoughts. Humanity sent doctors and engineers to every world that needed them, just as they had before. But now the medical ships traveled with warships beside them. The galaxy's saying changed. The old version was, if you want something built, call the humans. The new version was, if you want something built, call the humans. If you want something to survive, do not make them come back. The Vraxith, under new civilian leadership, slowly rebuilt. They were not the same. The generation that had grown up after the war was different. They had been raised on a world rebuilt by the hands of the species their parents had tried to destroy. Some of them hated humanity. Some of them were grateful. Most of them were simply confused by a universe that was more complicated than they had been taught. On Elysium 4, the scars healed slowly. The colony was resettled, though it never reached its old population. New Accra was rebuilt. The streets were clean, and the buildings were new, but everyone who lived there knew what was underneath. The soil remembered what had soaked into it. The air had been cleaned, but the old residents said that sometimes, on quiet nights, the winds still smelled like smoke. A park was built, where the children's hospital had stood. At its center was a statue. It showed a man kneeling, holding a child against his chest with one arm, and reaching out with the other, as if trying to shield something he knew he could not save. The face was calm. The eyes were kind. A small plaque at the base read, Dr. Emil HFY, pediatrician. He asked us not to look away. Lena Vasquez came to the memorial on the 10th anniversary of the massacre. She was 73 now. Her hair was fully silver. She walked with a cane. She had not returned to diplomacy. She lived quietly on Earth, in the same apartment in Lisbon where she had watched the war unfold on a screen. She wrote sometimes, letters mostly, to people she had known on Elysium 4. Letters she could never send. She stood before the statue of Emil HFY and placed a small bundle of white flowers at its base. The sun was warm. Birds that had been introduced to the planet decades ago sang in the new trees. The park was full of people. Some were original survivors. Some were new settlers. Some were aliens from species that had come to pay their respects. And standing at the edge of the park, watching with wide and curious eyes, was a Vraxith child. A girl, maybe 7 years old. She was part of the post-war generation, born on the Vraxith homeworld and brought here by her parents, who worked in the rebuilding effort. She did not know what this place had been. She only knew that the statue was of a man who helped children, and that the old woman with the flowers looked very sad. Vasquez saw the child watching. Their eyes met. The Vraxith girl tilted her head in the way her species did when they were curious. Vasquez looked at her for a long moment. This child's people had killed everyone she loved on this world, and now this child stood in the park built on their ashes. innocent, confused, alive. Vasquez smiled. It was a sad smile, but it was real. But in her mind, she thought the words that she had been turning over for 10 years, the words that she would never say aloud because they were too complicated and too simple at the same time. We were the best of the galaxy once, the kindest, the gentlest. We proved that a species born in blood could choose to be something beautiful. And then they reminded us of what we were before. And we reminded them. Perhaps that is what it means to be human. Not one thing or the other. Not the healer or the destroyer. Both. Always both. The hand that holds the wound closed, and the hand that made the blade. She looked at the statue of the doctor who had died trying to save children who were not his own. She looked at the Vraxith child, who stood in the garden that grew from their graves. Perhaps now we can be both, and perhaps that is enough. She placed her hand on the statue's base, felt the warmth of the stone, and stood there in the sunlight for a long time, saying nothing, while the wind moved through the new trees, and the birds sang songs that no one on this world had heard before.